Vaush is a self-identified socialist political streamer who is a pretty controversial figure online. In answer to this controversy, Vaush's fans and Vaush himself have in turn taken to calling the criticisms of Vaush derangement syndrome, or VDS for short. Countless videos have been made criticizing Vaush at this point. But I think I have a bit of a different perspective on the issue of Vaush compared to these other videos, because I used to be a huge Vaush fan myself. For a period of around 4 to 5 months, I watched most of the videos he released on YouTube basically every single day. Before school, after school, wherever, I listened to his life takes, his political takes, and yes, his media takes. I even watched a good half or so of his 5-hour-long rankings of Dark Souls bosses. What I'm trying to communicate is how much I respected Vaush's opinion. I never uncritically adored the guy. I wasn't one of the fans that seemingly spent all day on the internet defending him, but for a good while I thought he was pretty much without exception the smartest, most principled person on the left. And that's exactly what he wants everyone to think.
Can you give some examples of creators to the left of me who are good? Who's to the left of me? I don't even know what that means anymore. Apparently people who are more to the left of me are like revolutionary LARPers who have no idea how any of these political systems work and stand authoritarian governments. Are they to the left of me? Does it make, like, are people who defend China to my left? What does that mean even? I'm genuinely asking. I'm not being rhetorical. I don't know what it means to be more to the left of me. As far as I'm concerned, everything that I do is in the pursuit of what I think is the best path towards socialism. The fastest and most effective path possible. In my opinion,
On a surface level, it's not entirely surprising that people do think so highly of Vaush. Vaush's speech is articulate, his voice is strong and commanding, and his politics do overall seem to be pretty progressive to those that aren't very educated when it comes to politics, like I was. And the warning signs, like the fact that he openly admits that he's a lazy person.
By my nature, I am a lazy person. I'm just work shy.
Or the fact that he spends much of the time in his reactions to criticisms of him distractedly talking to chat, or playing a video game, or not even watching most of the video. Or the fact that he proudly seems to be basically all of his research straight from Wikipedia, are to many politically immature people seen not as warning signs but as beacons. No one could be this impossibly confident in themselves unless they were really right about almost everything, right? This incredible confidence makes him such an attractive person to so many politically unsure, vaguely left-leaning people as I was. But what specifically is the harm with Vaush then? Are Vaush's critics from the left really the ones with VDS? And why does yet another video about this guy really need to be made? Well, the thing is, I want to actually talk about something broader than just Vaush, and to get an idea of what I mean, let's start by watching Vaush's video, This Is How I Want to Build Socialism. I won't dive into the entire 25-minute video, but long story short, Vaush's main argument for how to achieve socialism is by building support for left-leaning politicians by voting for them, so that these politicians can begin to make socialist positions more popular, so that when a revolution that he believes is apparently inevitable comes thanks to climate change, enough people will support leftist politics to make a successful revolution possible. The problem is, if we look at history, any democratic attempts to establish a socialist government have throughout history been crushed. Just look at the lengths finance capital went to sabotage Bernie, who was really just a social democrat and not even a democratic socialist in both 2016 and 2020. We also saw the Labour Party deliberately sabotage its own candidate in Jeremy Corbyn to an even greater extent throughout his tenure as leader of the opposition. The closest to a successful democratic socialist attempt in history, in Salvador Allende's Chile, ended up with Allende committing suicide as his government was couped. Even if just a social democratic system somehow managed to be implemented in America, this would actually most likely prevent a full socialist revolution from happening, climate change or not. That's because reforms under social democracy have historically tended to placate people within a country from wanting any more dramatic changes. You can't really have a revolution if enough people are already happy enough with society as it is. No social democratic country has ever had anything close to a revolution for that reason. FDR was a perfect example of social democracy in action. He put through bills and reforms that probably helped the country for the better, but these reforms also helped prevent an actual revolution by placating people just enough that they weren't willing to actually revolt and put in place more permanent, concrete measures to ensure their well-being. Similarly, numerous countries across Europe after the rise of the USSR themselves enacted social democratic policies as an act of explicitly preventing revolution.
Frankly, I don't really want to implement leftist policies in this country through fucking executive action. Is that really the way we want to do it? Now, I'm not saying I didn't want Bernie to win. Of course I did, but we have to recognize the dude would have been working with a handicap. But doing this through executive action, just the president unilaterally doing this stuff, it's a bad precedent. And the next president can just undo it. Anything you do via executive action can just be undone via executive action. Whereas if you have it pushed through House and Congress and so on and so forth, it is much, much harder to undo that stuff. Much harder.
Far more importantly, though, than what Vaush says is what's missing from Vaush's analysis of how he actually wants to build socialism. What happens after the supposed revolution occurs. He doesn't at all talk about this in the video. And the reason Vaush doesn't actually go into what he would envision a post-revolution society to be is because, I would argue, he's unserious about imagining any form of actually existing socialism in the first place. This picture is a perfect summation of Vaush's lack of any rigor when it comes to his understanding of actually existing socialist experiments and researching in general. Notice how, according to the timestamp of the tweets, Vaush asked for research about Cuba, then spent less than an hour, it could have been as little as literally a couple minutes, actually researching the issue, before then tweeting out the absolute gold standard blue dog Democrat Nancy Pelosi talking point of how the embargo is bad, yes, but what about the poor people not getting enough from their government? Now, to be fair, Vaush's video on the topic of Cuba is actually not completely terrible. It's a somewhat fair analysis in many ways, but he still does the same approach of criticizing Cuba's methods without actually in any way analyzing why a state like Cuba might function the way it does in the first place. If Vaush looked with clear eyes at the history of imperialism in South America, he would know that in Cuba, before Batista, the winning candidate of Cuba's so-called elections was always a puppet of the US, just like in every so-called democracy in South America during the Cold War, and in many cases since then as well. If Fidel had simply turned Cuba into democracy as Americans conceive of it again, and completely let freedom of press and capitalist parties exist, the US would have funded fake newspapers and fake politicians, and those politicians would have gone on to win, and Cuba would have been turned more or less back into exactly what it was under Batista. Cuba does have a democracy of its own, where only people in the Communist Party, i.e. people who support or claim to support socialism, can actually run. It might sound more ideal to just do a socialism through elections that allow all viewpoints, including capitalists, to have their say, but as I've explained already, it's never happened once in history. You can't have a socialist society that has the classic party range from the far left party to the far right parties that exist in so-called liberal democracies. Why would you ever allow a pro-capitalist party to exist in a society that supposedly wants to eliminate capitalism? The only answer is that you would prefer capitalism if a so-called democracy voted for it than socialism. Socialist states have one party because the goal of the socialist state is to build socialism. There is no room for capitalist parties that are against that goal. There can of course be debate within the party itself, but the end goal must be to building socialism. Here's another example of Vaush's seemingly willful ignorance about actually existing socialism in a debate that he had against a YouTuber named Fellow Traveler.
About how can a society be authoritarian in socialism when socialism is democratic means control over the means of production? It's completely
Socialism is social ownership of the means of production. To get to a point to where you have people as direct worker owners requires a great deal of societal evolution and advancements that the Bolsheviks simply could not reach. They were an agrarian peasant society where you had small-scale production, petty bourgeois mindsets, and small-scale production reproduces capitalist economic relations.
I know, excuse.
How is this an excuse? I'm providing you with
This was a debate I remember watching when I was still a big Vaush fan, and I was taken aback at this part. Rather than criticize Traveler for what he said, rather than provide counterpoints and debate the facts, which is what Vaush talks about all the time, is debating the facts, showing evidence, Vaush just says excuses. That was all the master debater had to say in response. If Vaush was educated on this time period, he could have said something in response to this, right? Like, dishonest or not, he could have said something.
If you're rooting your like political philosophy in the aesthetic of like adopting the positions of some long dead person rather than a material analysis of the world that you live in, then you are an aesthetically oriented leftist, and you're not doing anyone any service.
Vaush apparently thinks material analysis is important, but at the same time applying real-world material analysis to the USSR is just excuses. Vaush is more than happy to say whatever fits best for him in the moment. When demonizing Tankies, material analysis is good. A rambling, incoherent 45 minutes worth of material analysis is also apparently really important in explaining why Biden is putting kids in cages. But when a Marxist-Leninist like fellow traveler uses material analysis to explain the conditions in the USSR at the time...
I know, excuse.
Vaush is pretty well known for his opinions on Marxist-Leninists at this point, which he generally more or less just calls Tankies now.
Do you know of any non-tanky ML channels? No, I don't. I'm sorry.
Yet he's also shown time and time again that he knows nothing about Marxism-Leninism by claiming, laughably, that Marxism-Leninism doesn't even exist.
Marxist-Leninism doesn't mean anything. It doesn't. It gets pulled into whatever state-defending, authoritarian, justifying bullshit it needs to represent the interests of state leaders. It doesn't mean anything, so it can mean anything.
This is such a ridiculous, delusional thing to say on so many levels. Marxism-Leninism at its basics simply argues for a vanguard party to seize power on behalf of the proletariat and establish a one-party socialist state called the dictatorship of the proletariat. The state would control the means of production, suppress opposition, counter-revolution, and the bourgeoisie in order to create an eventual communist society that would be classless and stateless. Countless millions of people in the 20th century from all around the world fought and died for freedom from capitalism, as well as from colonial and imperialist rule by the West, to varying success, under the explicit ideology of Marxism-Leninism. It very much exists. And it's not just a justification for authoritarian states either. Marxism-Leninism is a scientific, realist response to the material reality of trying to establish and maintain a socialist state under the current world dominance of imperialist capitalism. This is not hard to understand if you read about the history of socialist struggle, read about what capitalism will do to maintain its power, and read about what people on the ground in the third world had to do and still will have to do to fight to establish and maintain a socialist society. But Vaush is obsessed with doubling and tripling down on this idea, even though many of his own audience have criticized him for it by pointing out the same basic facts that I am. More on this later. Of course, while he's very fond of demonizing Marxist-Leninists, he at the same time loves to tokenize Marxist-Leninists like Fred Hampton by claiming that they inspired him to get into politics in order for Vaush to give himself this veil of radicalism.
Literally got into leftism because of the Black Panther Party. The assassination of Fred Hampton's on a bookshelf to my left. That's still, like, to me, the foundational text that I use that got me into this whole political scheme.
He gets explicitly called out for just how he tokenizes radical leftists to make himself look more radical than he is in this next clip.
Wait, they're like fact-checking me with text. If you were consistent, you'd be deriding the Panthers for being tankies instead of tokenizing them for your bullshit argument. How the fuck am I tokenizing the Black Panther Party by saying they fought for racial equality? What the fuck? That is some weird... That is a very strange accusation.
This is another one of Vaush's favorite strategies, and his fans bite it every single time, where he acts incredibly indignant at something a person says, as if it's the most idiotic thing ever, without ever actually addressing the claim that person makes at all. You can support a movement or a person while also tokenizing them by making them look less radical at the same time, and this clip goes on to perfectly show exactly how Vaush does that.
That is a very strange accusation. Not just socialism. Material conditions can mean fucking... The Panthers fought for racial equality by pursuing national liberation with a Marxist-Leninist analysis such a... Okay, yeah, so they're just whining about it. Lesbians marching outside of the Washington... Okay? History? And you are lucky that I personally got Biden into office, because otherwise... Is Hakeem from Iraq? Well, hey, listen, okay? We're gonna get Biden to get those troops out of Iraq, okay? Wait, did he already do that? We're gonna keep Biden from fucking bombing any more of your airports, okay? That's what we're gonna do. You're welcome, Hakeem. True.
When Vaush gets to the word Marxist-Leninist, his mouth suddenly spazzes out. He mumbles about how the video is complaining about him before he skips past the fact that the Black Panthers were MLs without even addressing it. He's just far too egotistical to admit his smear of MLs all being useless authoritarian losers was just exposed in front of his audience. And so he has to move on as fast as possible. And by doing so, he is of course doing the definition of political tokenization. He's doing the timeless act of co-opting radicalism and making it less radical. Just like neoliberals do with MLK, praising him as an inspiration while completely ignoring how radical he actually was.
I literally got into leftism because of the Black Panther Party. The assassination of Fred Hampton's on a bookshelf to my left. That's still, like, to me, the foundational text that I use that got me into this whole political scheme. Marxist-Leninism doesn't mean anything. It doesn't.
Vaush at least does acknowledge in the latest of his anti-Marxist-Leninist videos recently released that the Black Panthers were also influenced heavily by Maoism, but he still weirdly doesn't admit that they were also Marxist-Leninists. And he also argues that he thinks they're different from regular people that call themselves Maoists.
So when the Black Panther Party calls themselves Maoist, what do they actually mean? What are they referring to? Well, in their case, they were referring largely to organizational and revolutionary structures. Whereas in the case of regular people who call themselves Maoists, I interpret that as a defense of Mao, like as a leader.
The ideas of both following a Maoist revolutionary structure or supporting past socialist leaders, those are not two mutually exclusive ideas like he seems to be saying. And he's also just wrong. Huey Newton saw Mao as a hero. He visited China and met with Zhou Enlai, one of Mao's closest allies. Fred Hampton also highly admired Mao, not to mention Lenin and Che and Kim Il-sung. Of course, if anyone in this day and age said that kind of stuff that Fred Hampton said about people like Mao, Vaush would instantly call them a tankie. He's just spouting a bunch of nonsense that isn't consistent at all with his opinions because it's just convenient in this moment when it comes to demonizing Marxist-Leninists and Maoists. What Vaush is basically trying to establish is that when there is any case where Marxist-Leninists or Maoists are seen as acceptable within the confines of what Vaush personally sees as acceptable, Vaush can just say, oh, but they're not the regular people Maoists or Marxist-Leninists who are just authoritarians or Mao defenders or whatever. He's openly said this kind of thing in the same clip where he said Marxism-Leninism doesn't mean anything.
And frankly, I think a lot of the people who call themselves Marxist-Leninists that aren't lunatics probably just, that doesn't even describe their ideology that well.
So what he's basically saying is that his apparent political idols like Fred Hampton or Thomas Sankara were misguided about calling themselves MLs at all in the first place. They just weren't real MLs, as he calls it. He realizes he can't just ignore that organizations like the Black Panthers are Marxist-Leninist or Maoist, so he has to resort to just saying that they aren't actual Marxist-Leninists. This is just an even more blatant form of tokenization than before. He's openly admitting that he's tokenizing them. He's doing the same thing as if you confronted a neolib about how MLK was a socialist, and then they would say, well, he wasn't like a regular people socialist like that Lenin guy or that crazy Ho Chi Minh guy. He wasn't a real socialist. The most amazing part is that Vaush claims he's tried to be conciliatory.
Every single time, I've really tried to be conciliatory here. Every single time, I'm like, hey, you know, not all MLs are like this one, or 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 this one. Eventually, I have to draw the line. I think MLs are just like that, yeah.
It's just a complete lie to say you've been conciliatory by just writing off all of the many counters to your argument as not being real counters when they absolutely are. It's especially remarkable that a person as dishonest about his political beliefs as Vaush would be the one to say that socialists who actually fought for socialism are the actual people who weren't actually of the political ideology they ascribe themselves to. It's just amazing how patronizing and how egotistical he is. But only now are we finally arriving at the best part of it all. In continuing his remarkable quest to say Marxism-Leninism doesn't exist, Vaush goes on to say maybe the single dumbest thing I think I've ever heard him say.
Like, if you take a look at the ideological, tenets of Marxism-Leninism, they're really inconsistent. They literally vary country to country, which is why you hear Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics, or with Vietnamese characteristics, or with Cuban characteristics, or with Russian. Oh, what they're saying is that there's not actually a Marxism-Leninism. It's just a state ideology. They're essentially saying Marxism-Leninism is a broad label that you just use alongside a state apparatus to justify the existence of that state.
It is just beyond belief how ignorant and stupid, yet so confident in themselves someone can be. All ideologies of all sorts are adaptable because the conditions of countries and their leaders' perspectives of how to solve the country's problems all differ to some extent. Even if two governments call themselves a liberal democracy, those two governments will still have ways in which their governments differ from one another. By Vaush's logic, does that mean liberal democracies don't exist? It's just a totally incoherent argument to make. Of course, he doesn't really believe what he's saying deep down. It's just convenient for him to say this specifically about Marxism-Leninism because that is an ideology he is obsessed not only with critiquing and, examining, but just bad faith demonizing no matter what. Vaush has always been fond of calling Marxist-Leninists people who are just obsessed with aesthetics, as he pronounces it.
If you're rooting your political philosophy in the aesthetic of adopting the positions of some long dead person rather than a material analysis of the world that you live in, then you're an aesthetically oriented leftist and you're not doing anyone any service.
But there is nothing more aesthetic than saying the Marxist-Leninist Fred Hampton is a single inspiration that got you into politics in order to portray yourself as radical and edgy, but then saying at the same time that Marxist-Leninists are idiots or stains on the socialist movement or authoritarian fascists. Marxist-Leninists Vaush claims to admire, like Fred Hampton and Thomas Sankara, fought and died for socialism. Marxist-Leninist revolutionary groups fighting today in places like India, the Philippines, and Turkey are fighting and dying for socialism. Ultimately, whether or not you agree with Marxism-Leninism as an ideology is one thing, but it's impossible to ignore how dishonest Vaush is when it comes to that ideology. Privileged, first-world, aesthetically oriented socialists like Vaush argue that anything that may have gone wrong in past and current socialist systems is a definite indicator that the people in charge are not real socialists, while ignoring the reality of running a socialist state, which in all historical examples started out as incredibly isolated, poor, and with capitalist enemies that wanted to do everything humanly possible to destroy them on every side, and that therefore Marxism-Leninism is just a justification for authoritarianism. As Michael Parenti writes in his book Blackshirts and Reds, the pure socialist ideological anticipations reign untainted by existing practice. They do not explain how the manifold functions of revolutionary society would be organized, how external attack and internal sabotage would be thwarted, how bureaucracy would be avoided, scarce resources allocated, policy difference settled, priorities set, and production and distribution conducted. Instead, they offer vague statements about how the workers themselves will directly own and control the means of production, and will arrive at their own solutions through creative struggle. No surprise, then, that pure socialists support every revolution, except the ones that succeed. This is, of course, Vaush in a nutshell. The only type of revolutionary he'll support is the likes of Thomas Sankara, who was lucky to die early enough to not make any big mistakes in his policies, or to be successful enough that the capitalist propaganda machine would have to kick into full gear to demonize him as much as possible. Vaush has no end of criticism for socialist experiments, but in the entire video about how he wants to build socialism, Vaush never once mentions what happens once the revolution occurs, what his socialist experiment might actually look like. It's obviously extremely difficult to do this in a single video, especially one that's only 25 minutes long, but in a video titled How I Want to Build Socialism, I'd expect more than to just mysteriously stop right at the mention of a revolution and then say nothing more. But again, the reason for this is pretty simple. Vaush is an aesthetically oriented socialist and nothing more. He has never actually given the first thought to how a revolution might actually survive because he doesn't really believe in a revolution all that much in the first place. Of course, Vaush is not a new phenomenon. Countless so-called socialists throughout history have also denounced any actual socialist experiments. Vaush is just part of a long line of so-called socialist, anti-socialist propagandists more effective than just about anyone else alive at denigrating the same political movements they claim to support. After all, by instantly and totally conceding to the right wing's framing of these societies as dystopias without the tiniest bit of pushback, except sometimes Cuba where they might push back in the lightest of ways, other leftists, uneducated about these issues, like I was, can look at people like Vaush and think that if even a socialist is anti-USSR, then the USSR must have been an authoritarian dystopia, right? The anti-USSR works of useful idiots like George Orwell, after all, were promoted heavily by the CIA for a very good reason. Of course, it's almost acceptable for people in Orwell's time to have succumbed to the endless propaganda, but there is not much of an excuse in this day and age when there is so much information out there and you have been confronted on your lack of knowledge time and time again. Unsurprisingly, most of Vaush's audience are also pure socialists themselves. I got instantly banned from his Discord for just trying to say the same things people like Fellow Traveler and Michael Parenti have said. Of course, how has Vaush so effectively completely shut down any conversation with people to his left, people who try to debunk these and similar falsehoods that he spreads? And how has he cultivated such a large, devoted audience in the process? Well, Vaush has a Batman's tool belt full of strategies that he uses to avoid and defect criticism or demonize his critics, both in debates and out of them. One of his very main strategies against people to his left is to scarecrow them by comparing their arguments or them to Nazis or fascists. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not bad per se to use Nazi comparisons. It's actually often very warranted. But to compare it to people to his left, genuine socialists, the same types of people who once fought against Nazi occupation as hard as anyone, is incredible. He's made fascist or Nazi or Holocaust supporting accusations against the likes of Professor Flowers, Luna Oy, Non-Compete, Bad Empanada, Fellow Traveler, Danky King, Hakeem, and I'm sure many, many more. Of course, these same red fascists acknowledge actual red fascists, also known as Patsacks or Nazbols, people like Jackson Hinkle or Infrared, for being crazy all the time. There is very clear and extensive evidence for this. It's not like a couple people, like these people are widely condemned or at least disliked by most of the people that Vaush calls Tankies. Vaush says he's not against the idea of critical support, but let's be honest, he's just a liar to say that and then lump all Marxist-Leninists into a single category.
Every single time, I'm like, hey, you know, not all MLs are like this one, or 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 this one. Eventually, I have to draw the line. I think MLs are just like that.
It's not in Vaush's interest to make a distinction between Patsocks and the likes of Fellow Traveler or Hakeem, who have both positive and negative things to say about the USSR, but Hakeem has criticized Vaush, as many other Marxist-Leninists have also criticized him, so they are all red fascists, even though most of them do not uncritically support countries like Russia or China, or express racist or anti-LGBTQ views like the minority of Patsocks do. If you're someone like me, though, who was very loyal to Vaush for a while, his strategy of scarecrowing his opponents as insane or fascist or uneducated really helps to shut down any rational discussion where Vaush knows he would lose. It shuts down any willingness on the part of his audience to critically engage at all with what the opponent is saying. The problem, of course, with this strategy is that if you actually do critically engage with the content of most of the people he demonizes, you will quickly see that many of them aren't uneducated and aren't fascists. This is what happened with me. Professor Flowers was painted as an insane, white genocide-wanting, black supremacist monster, and after watching Vaush's review of the debate, I totally believed him. I remember thinking what a freak this lady was. But I still decided that it would be worthwhile to hear her perspective because I didn't think Vaush was the ultimate authority and I wanted to hear the other side. Then I watched her video responding to the debate she had with Vaush about black nationalism, and I saw that she was far more rational than Vaush painted her. If you're gonna say, oh, PF supports genocide, just shut the fuck up and watch all 4 of her videos about Vaush like I did, multiple times, and understand that you're wrong and you're listening to Vaush's disgusting smear of her rather than actually listening to her. Anyways, then while I was making this video, I also saw her follow-up video about harassment caused by the false accusations made by Vaush against her, made her stop making videos again, and even drove her to almost killing herself. And that's what really turned my fucking stomach. Thanks directly to Vaush, these were people who I'd painted in my mind as insane fascists without ever in any real way actually knowing anything about them. I'd just taken Vaush's word for it and the way he'd interpreted Flower's words without any critical thinking on my part, and someone had gotten hurt because countless other people did the same. It is cult-like how Vaush has to paint these people as insane and as deranged as possible in order to prevent any chance of people actually engaging with their content at all, and it works. Of course, Professor Flowers almost killed herself as a result of the harassment she received. There is consequences to Vaush's actions. Saying not to harass someone is not nearly enough. Vaush openly admits he's lazy. He openly admits he's work shy, yet he acts like and is considered an authority when it comes to politics. So when he calls someone a genocide supporter, his politically uneducated fan base is going to see them as a genocide supporter and treat them as such. Also, while he claims not to support harassing, he just straight up actually does advocate for harassing people. He just keeps it vague enough by using his favorite word, tankies. And of course, the word tankies at this point has become so vague and nebulous of a term that Vaush is basically just saying, whether he means it or not, to harass anyone to my left that criticizes me. As a side note, it's also very funny to make fun of Red Eye posting when he himself has posted at least 5 thumbnails of Biden with glowing eyes to his YouTube. The guy is just such a projecting, dishonest hypocrite, and if you ever confront him on these kinds of inconsistencies, he'll just use another tool in his belt by going to irony to avoid actual criticism of him, by just leaning into it and saying something like, "Dark Brandon, hell yeah," without ever actually addressing his hypocrisy.
True!
Whether demonizing his critics is insane, or never letting a debate opponent finish a sentence, or framing his extensive sexual harassment, threats of rape, silencing and defaming of Poppy as, quote, being weird on Discord, or other things I won't even get into in this video, Vaush is a master at controlling the narrative. If things get bad enough that even with all his dishonest tactics there's no way to spin things in his favor, he'll just not post his debate at all. But sometimes Vaush's dishonest strategies backfire, as it did with Professor Flowers, where Vaush gained support but also a lot of critics. Or when Vaush's argument that Marx, Lenin, Mao, and others would have voted for Biden was extensively debunked by at least 7 different YouTubers, including Hakeem, Zizi, Socialism for All, Bad Empanada, Bad Mouse, Danky Kang, and Fellow Traveler. It's pretty much gotten to the point that most of the online left creator sphere refuses to associate with him. And while Vaush at least has the mental capacity to recognize this same fact, he literally argues that the main reason is that people don't like him because he's an edgy alpha male, and that because of this fact, other creators won't associate with him because it might hurt their channels. That's literally the entire video. I'm not strawmanning him, that is his argument, and he says it over and over and over again. Not only bragging about himself by portraying himself as this edgy alpha loner, who everyone rejects because of how he speaks the truth, he's also just openly insulting other online left creators, but making it seem like they don't associate with him since they're just concerned with their own image, rather than not associating with him because, you know, much of the online left might find him distasteful as a person or politically or both. He basically just sounds like an outright fucking weirdo the entire time. Of course, despite having been embarrassed numerous times thanks to so-called tankies, Vaush is pretty fond of talking about how much these tankies are scared of debating him at the same time.
Do you think you'll ever re-debate Hakeem? I sincerely doubt that Hakeem will ever talk to me again. Usually that's what happens with these people. They dip their toe in the water, and once they realize it's too hot for them, they dip out. But nobody does talk to me. Nobody does talk to me. People who freak out about me and make response videos and they get clout off me, they don't ever want to talk to me. Nobody who disagrees with me talks to me and comes away looking good, because usually the people who I end up getting in these beefs with don't have good enough points to merit them talking directly to me.
But it's pretty weird to gloat about how lefties won't debate you because they're too scared, while at the same time refusing to debate them. I talked to Fellow Traveler about the Vaush debate. He tried to debate Vaush again, and he got a response from Vaush saying he didn't want to. To be fair, Vaush has admitted that he emailed Vaush again asking for another debate, but he interestingly doesn't mention that he said no.
This guy actually emailed me a little while ago, asking for another debate, and admitted that he was drunk the first time.
Danky Kang, another so-called tanky who makes videos about Vaush, also wanted to debate Vaush, but the best Vaush would give is answering things that Danky Kang said in Vaush's chat while Vaush played Sekiro. But Vaush later said to his chat that,
does everyone remember Danky Kang? That tanky? Yeah, you remember? The tanky who shit-talked me for like a month, and I brought him on, and he like flubbed his way through a conversation?
Vaush is a liar. He never brought Danky Kang on the stream. At best, he's seriously misremembering what actually happened, and the proof of it isn't hidden, it's all recorded, it's all there. Of course, then his narrative for why he doesn't want to debate Tankies at some point changed, but it got even more idiotic.
Have you received no debate requests from pedestrian Tankies in these troubled times? I have, but like most of them aren't really worth it. I like arguing with people who are wrong. If they weren't wrong, then we wouldn't be arguing. But past a certain level of disinformation, all I'm really doing is giving them a platform to ramble. Or to put it another way, if they are so propagandistic that there's no relationship between the words that I'm saying and the words that they're saying, at that point we're not really having a debate. We're just having a back and forth rant to the audience. And if I want to rant to my audience, I can do it anytime I want to, whereas they can only rant to my audience when I bring them on. So I don't feel it's worth it. It's the same reason why, like, I don't go out of my way looking for, you know, like Holocaust deniers or whatever. If I want to, these points can be dismantled without them here. It's not that I'm afraid of debating them. It's that the information you guys would get from me would be identical in either case because they would never respond to the arguments that I make. So it would literally just be a regular rant of mine interspersed with misinformation from them.
What a complete and total bunch of the most pathetic, meaningless word salad I have ever heard in my life. I mean, what is a single thing here that you couldn't apply to right-wingers, Holocaust deniers or not, as much as left-wingers? Vaush's justification for debating right-wingers has always been to bring people left, quote-unquote. This is such a bizarre double standard. By debating so-called Tankies, couldn't you try to bring people away from Tankyism, just like you're supposedly trying to do when it comes to the far right? But no, because people who support the USSR are apparently as delusional as Holocaust deniers, so it's just not even worth trying. It's just so obvious that, again, he doesn't mean anything he's saying, and he's just doing yet another tool in his tool belt, which is to use his idiotic word salad strategy to avoid the fact that, yes, he is afraid of debating people to his left. What is particularly fucked up about the idea that he won't even debate lefties on his stream is that he continues to defend or be friends with disgusting transphobes like Shoeonhead, who equate drag shows with grooming to the point that even his fanbase calls him out on it. And only when Vaush fully realizes he can't defend and enable Shoe anymore without his audience basically leaving him, does Vaush truly go hard on her. Or what about Hunter Avallone, who thinks the CIA is apparently a trustworthy institution?
If you don't trust the CIA, then who do you trust?
And Vaush will not only debate, but suck up to an Israeli Zionist ethno-nationalist, or a literal natural gas lawyer, or an actual American military officer that participated in Operation Iraqi Freedom. But he says he regrets platforming Hakeem. I mean, you can't make this shit up. How does anyone in their right mind still consider this person to be a leftist? Vaush has debated Tankies a couple of times more recently, like Yankee Tanky, for example, but that was one of the disciples of Caleb Maupin, who is already incredibly unliked, as I've already shown. It's clear he's ignoring people who've actually read theory and know what they're talking about, so he can instead make himself look cool by talking to complete idiots because he is a coward and a liar.
So I'd like it if you, just 1 second.
We're not actually gonna get through this.
I would like to just establish this. I would appreciate it if you treated me with the same level of respect that I have treated you with thus far. I did not start interrupting you until you started interrupting me, sir.
I'm not a big fan of liberal.
You didn't start insulting.
I'm not a big fan of liberal.
I mean, you're the one who started insulting me, like just to try and get an emotional response out of me.
From my perspective,
you're trying to get an emotional response out of me to make me look bad. That's exactly what you're doing right now.
We need to be able to talk, or we can't do this, okay? The reason why I'm being rude to you is because, as far as I'm concerned, you're a pestilence on my movement.
But when you're engaged in a debate environment, there's a baseline level of charitability that you have to engage in before it becomes a problem. There are people saying, who cares? This is just optics. No, it's not.
Because, as far as I'm concerned, you're a pestilence on my movement. You're a group of state-worshipping autocrats who completely misunderstand what socialism is and don't understand that the Wait,
when is it your
actually have to stop. You actually have to stop.
Since when is it your movements? I thought it was our movement, Vaush. Since when is it your movements?
Please.
Are you just trying to build an audience or movements? You trying to build an audience or a movement, Vaush?
Vaush slips up here and says, my social movement. It's not the only time he said it either.
Don't denigrate my social movement with your nonsense.
Given how demonstrable Vaush's insane ego is, given how obsessed he is with maintaining his image at all costs, I don't think it's a stretch that he really does think this is his movement. But he can't be his movement if he is made to look bad in any way, shape, or form. In any case, even if people were avoiding debating him, I wouldn't even blame them. Winning debates does not mean coming away from an argument as the logically superior person. Winning is making sure that by the end of the debate, the chat, the audience, whatever, is on your side. And that's the problem with debates. Vaush doesn't have to be right morally or factually, he just needs to frame the conversation to his audience as him being right, as him winning, and then he wins. And that he is very, very good at. I don't think debate culture is inherently terrible or that it can't bring people to the left, and I won't contest the fact that many people claim to have been brought to the left by Vaush. But I think what these people don't realize is that being brought to the left doesn't mean you were brought over to leftism. You might be less of a right-winger than you once were, but if Vaush is the only or main person you rely on for your political opinions, you are by no means an actual leftist. The reason Vaush is seen by some as a good debater and has such a large audience is twofold. Firstly, he debates a lot of fascists and right-wingers who are the dumbest people alive and incredibly easy to debunk. Secondly, it's simply because he never concedes on anything. It's like a child changing the rules in a game of chess on the whim to make sure they win. As Vladimir Lenin once wrote in The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, it is therefore impossible to argue, to debate with Kautsky. All we can do is demonstrate why Kautsky cannot be called anything else but a renegade. Given that I know Vaush's bad faith, having spent countless hundreds of hours researching about the guy, given that I know he will never change, I wish we could just ignore Vaush. But I think there's a responsibility to hit back hard and repeatedly, because he is one of the biggest left-wing content creators there is, and he has a ton of influence that he does not wield wisely. There is hope, mind you. According to YouTube, Vaush's 38 most popular videos all have come out over a year ago now, and his subscriber account has mostly stalled. His viewership is clearly going down, and that is a wonderful thing. But Vaush is still very important, so it's still important to keep hitting back and to turn that downward slope in viewers into a cliff. Responding to people like Vaush is a matter, to me, of doing it the right way, through videos like this, and not, at least in most circumstances, to actually debate him, given how dishonest his debate tactics can be. I do think he has shown his colors in some debates in ways that have turned people off, so if you're truly prepared for the sheer extent of his bullshit, I won't advocate against debating him, but if you do, don't go in expecting to change Vaush. Vaush has shown time and time again that he is not good faith. Go in expecting harassment, strawmanning, and gaslighting, and maybe hoping that a few people, like I was in Fellow Traveler's debate with Vaush, might be persuaded. In the end, I'm not making this video for Vaush any more than I'd be debating Vaush for Vaush. I know if he somehow watches this at all, he'll make sure to demonize me, strawman me, and likely not even finish the video, which is just yet another part of his tool belt. I'm making this video for anyone in his audience who isn't either brainwashed or just a piece of shit. To Vaush's fans, if you consider yourself a socialist, and yet are incredibly against almost every socialist experiment in history, if you really consider yourself a socialist, yet you never read a single book about theory or history, and you display no interest in doing so, ask yourself why you aren't interested. Is this all about aesthetics to you? Because that's not what socialism is about. Socialism isn't science. It is a process, something that takes reading and patience and understanding, or at the very least a willingness to listen to the people who have done the reading and understanding and the organizing. In the end, if you are a Vaush fan, I challenge you to do what I did, to look at perspectives that challenge the narratives that Vaush is telling you. To look basically anywhere beyond just Vaush. Anyways, that's about all I have to say. It took me a long time to actually make this video because I'm kind of afraid of Vaush and of certain incredibly mean and toxic elements of his fan base, but at the same time I think these things just need to be said. Anyways, thanks for watching. Please support the video and the channel by liking, subscribing, and leaving a helpful comment. And spread the video to as many people as you can, especially any friends you might have that are fans of Vaush. You can also support me financially on Ko-Fi as I need funds to keep on making these videos. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time.